Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science. And today on Exploration, we're going to depart from our usual format and instead answer some of the emails that I get. And once again, it's impossible to answer all the emails that come flooding into my mailbox, so I'm going to group them into categories and try to answer some of them today. First of all, many people have asked my opinion about the Space Force. President Donald Trump has said that we need a new branch of the military, beyond just the Air Force and the Army and the Navy and the Coast Guard and the Marines. No, he's talking about a Space Force to dominate outer space. And the question is, what are the pros and cons of a Space Force? And then Mars. Did you know that at the end of July, Mars is going to be in opposition? This is a great opportunity to see Mars as one of the brightest objects in the night sky. That's right, you'll see this reddish-orange dot if you face south and near the end of July. And it means that we are in the closest approach to the red planet. And not only that, but we also have satellites that are converging on Mars. And we'll see a few things about the latest developments about the red planet. And then we'll see a few things about life in outer space. I get a lot of emails asking me, well, what is your opinion about whether or not there are aliens in outer space? How come they don't visit us? And what do they like anyway? Well, let's just jump right into some of the top stories of the past week. The number one question that I get in email concerns outer space, and specifically that's Donald Trump's plan to create a new Space Force. Now, to be fair, there are pluses and minuses to creating a new Space Force. First of all, let's not be naive. The Chinese and the Russians, they are experimenting with advanced weapons in outer space. For example, about 10 years ago, the Chinese displayed a certain amount of expertise in killer satellite warfare by literally blowing up one of their own satellites. That's right, there were two Chinese satellites. The first one shot some kind of projectile at the second Chinese satellite and blew it up. As a consequence, thousands of pieces of debris were created in outer space, creating an uproar. Because, of course, we don't need more space junk in outer space, and we don't need to test these weapons that could destroy our satellites. Well, because of that, the Chinese have not tested their killer satellite technology since then. However, let's be clear about this. The Russians, the Chinese, and the United States, all of them have the capability of knocking out satellites in outer space. And that would be the first phase of a war in outer space. Think of two gunfighters, where one gunfighter has the ability to reach down, grab sand, and throw sand in the enemy's eyes, blinding them and rendering them pretty much harmless. In other words, in a opening shots of a nuclear war in outer space, the first thing that a nation would do is to blind the enemy by knocking out their satellites. In that way, communications, reconnaissance, GPS, all of that would be wiped out, leaving the enemy pretty much helpless. And also, let me be clear, back in March, Vladimir Putin boasted of the fact that he's fielding a new type of nuclear weapon. That's right, a nuclear weapon beyond the usual ICBM is called the hypersonic weapon. Now, to be fair, the United States has also tested the hypersonic weapon and has pretty much abandoned it because it's too unstable. But let me explain. When an ICBM goes up into the atmosphere, eventually it has to come down to strike its target. At that point, the ICBM is vulnerable to anti-missile technology which might shoot down that missile. However, if the missile releases a hypersonic device, a device that travels many times faster than the speed of sound, it's almost like an airplane. It can maneuver and therefore evade any Star Wars system. In fact, Vladimir Putin boasted of the fact that it has tested its hypersonic weapon and it would effectively neutralize any Star Wars weapon created by the United States. So on one hand, the people who believe in a space force say that, well, the Russians have these weapons, the Chinese have their weapons, and we should not be caught flat-footed. Not to mention the fact that other countries are getting in the game. The Indians, for example, showed their prowess in outer space by shooting a space probe all the way to Mars on the first try. That was really a tour de force. And some people think that we could literally have a traffic jam around the moon as the Chinese, the Indians, the Japanese, the Russians, the European Union, that all these countries begin to go back to the moon. So, say some people, we need a cop on the block. For peaceful purposes, not for warlike purposes, we need a cop on the block to make sure that space is not nuclearized. Well, those are the pro reasons for having a new space force. However, there are also con reasons as well. First of all, let's be clear about this. Who is the most vulnerable to escalating into a new arms race in outer space? It's the United States. We have by far the largest investment in satellite technology in terms of the internet, telecommunications, the GPS, you name it. The United States is leading in that category in outer space. And so we are the most vulnerable if space gets militarized. You know, the Chinese have an expression, never pick up a rock, only to drop it on your own feet. And some people think that that's what it could be. If we start an arms race in outer space, say the critics, let's be clear. The Russians have already stated that they, too, will join in an arms race. And where is it going to lead? And then the next question, if you really want to destabilize and blind an enemy in the opening shots of a war, the simplest way to do it is to detonate an atomic or thermonuclear weapon in outer space, releasing the electromagnetic pulse, capable of wiping out communications for thousands of miles. Now, we know this because the United States in the past has actually detonated hydrogen warheads in outer space, creating havoc. Once the United States detonated a nuclear weapon over the Pacific, and the shock wave, the electromagnetic shock wave released from that burst of nuclear energy, interfered with telecommunications between San Francisco and Tokyo, and even burglar alarms. Burglar alarms were set off in Hawaii as a consequence. Physicists have since analyzed that detonation very carefully and have come to the conclusion that if that warhead is strategically placed, let's say, over Kansas, at the right altitude, at the right time, it could literally paralyze the electronics of the United States. This means that power plants would shut down because of short circuits. It means that satellites would be fried in outer space, rendering them useless. It means that telecommunications would be disrupted. It means that power would go down. I mean, think about the chaos that would erupt. In the long term, for example, refrigerators would go down. The food in your refrigerator would very quickly rot, and there would be food riots. In other words, we would be thrown back 100, 200 years into the past if just one nuclear bomb were strategically placed right over the United States. And that is the power of the electromagnetic pulse. You see, a nuclear weapon is much more dangerous in outer space than it is on the planet Earth. If you detonate a nuclear warhead, let's say in a major metropolitan city, the devastation would be measured in tens of miles. However, if you detonate that same weapon in outer space, the electromagnetic pulse, it would be measured in hundreds of miles, thereby rendering your telecommunications network inoperable. In fact, you don't even have to use sophisticated nuclear weapons. Let's say a small country has the ability to field a satellite and simply puts a barrel of nails in outer space. If you were to detonate an ordinary barrel of nails in outer space, you could wipe out hundreds of satellites that orbit the planet Earth. Now, of course, that will not create an electromagnetic pulse, but think of the havoc. Think of the havoc that's going to be unleashed if somebody were to paralyze our satellite force by doing something as simple as detonating a barrel of nails in outer space. The other problem with a Space Force is the cost and the bureaucracy. The United States Air Force already has command of much of our nuclear forces and our forces in outer space, and it would mean another layer of bureaucracy, which is going to cost money as a consequence. So what do we do about this? Well, perhaps the solution is not so distant. You see, back in 1967, the nations of the world signed the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty basically said that nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, should not be deployed in outer space, and that nations cannot own celestial bodies like the moon. Two very simple provisions. However, that was 1967. That treaty is way out of date for many reasons. First of all, although it bans the use of nuclear weapons in outer space, it says nothing about non-nuclear weapons in outer space. For example, about 10 years ago, when the Chinese knocked out one of their own satellites, many scientists believed that it was a projectile of some sort. A projectile that was shot in the direction of the other satellite, blowing it apart. So it wasn't that sophisticated. It wasn't a nuclear device to kill a satellite. And these weapons are not banned under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Or think of laser weapons. Of course, President Ronald Reagan put the initiative on the Star Wars program to use laser beams to shoot down nuclear weapons in space. But laser weapons are not weapons of mass destruction. They are not covered by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. Not to mention the fact that even though nations cannot own the moon, what about private individuals? Can they stake a flag on the moon and say, I want this to be the location of my new condo or my new office? Well, believe it or not, back in 1967, no one foresaw the fact that independent billionaires could become a space force in and of themselves. Who would have foreseen the fact that Elon Musk of SpaceX can create his own moon rocket, the Falcon Heavy, fully capable of reaching the moon with the Dragon capsule? Who would have thought back in 1967 that one man, or two men if you include Jeff Bezos of Amazon.com, could field a whole array of rockets which can reach outer space and reach the moon and perhaps even reach Mars? Who would have thought that? So I think the lesson here is, first of all, before we create a space force, we should revise the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. We need ground rules. Even if we do go forward with the Space Force, we still need ground rules to make sure that space is not nuclearized, that space is not weaponized, because, as I mentioned, who stands to lose the most once space is weaponized? We are the big losers in that situation. Also, speaking about outer space, Mars is in the news. First of all, in the end of July, you're going to have a treat. Look up in the night sky, face south, and look at a long arc that goes from southeast to southwest. That long, lazy arc across the sky is the ecliptic plane. And that's where the planets are. The planets all line up in a disk, and you're going to have a treat. You'll be able to see not just the planets, but also Mars at its closest point. And it'll be one of the brightest objects in the night sky. And yes, it'll be red, reddish orange. And that's one of the reasons why the Greeks and the Romans named it after the god of war. Mars is blood red. However, in reality, I should point out that Mars is actually the rusty planet. The reason why Mars is red is because of iron oxide. The oxygen in the atmosphere of Mars, whatever oxygen it had, began to oxidize with the iron chemicals in the soil to create red sand. And that's why Mars is red. Now, there's no need for binoculars, by the way. In fact, binoculars would be rather useless. If you have binoculars and tune it to Mars, you're not going to see much because Mars is really far away. You're talking about millions and millions of miles away. So even without binoculars, you'll be given a treat if you face south in the end of July to look for the red planet. And then we should also point out that just a few weeks ago, NASA had that huge press conference where it announced the fact that a big discovery has been made about ago on the press release, because the press release was deemed to be so sensitive. However, I hate to be the party pooper. However, the NASA press release simply said that our latest space probes on Mars have detected organic chemicals on the red planet. Now, does that mean life has been discovered on Mars? No. Organic chemicals simply means chemicals that contain carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Not even amino acids. Now, think of what your body is made of. Your body is basically made out of proteins. These proteins in turn can be broken down to amino acids. And these amino acids in turn are hydrocarbons. So these hydrocarbons were found on Mars. But amino acids, not yet. I should also point out in all fairness that we have seen amino acids everywhere in the universe. For example, meteors. When meteors come and strike the Earth, they become meteorites. And if you split open a meteorite, sure enough, you can find traces of amino acids in the heart of meteorites. Also, with our instruments, we can zero in on gas clouds in outer space, many, many light years away, nebulas. And it turns out that, yes, you see evidence of the spectral light coming from amino acids in these nebulae. Now, what does that mean? That means that the building blocks of life, amino acids, even though we haven't found them on Mars yet, the building blocks of life could be everywhere throughout the universe. On planets, asteroids, meteors, dust clouds, everywhere we look, we see the evidence of the chemicals which may make possible life in the universe. And speaking about life in the universe, I should point out that TESS and the Webb Space Telescope are going to be game changers in the future. In the past few decades, 2 satellites have given us enormous amounts of information about the universe. The first is the Hubble Space Telescope. In fact, it's perhaps one of the most productive instruments of science ever built. A bargain for just $1 billion. The Hubble Space Telescope. It's been able to peer into planets and black holes and answer many of the mysteries concerning the universe. The other great discoveries were made by the Kepler satellite, a satellite which was able to confirm 4,000 planets orbiting other stars in our galaxy. And the Kepler satellite even gave us a census of the Milky Way galaxy. For the first time, we now know that on average, every single star we see in the heavens has a planet going around it. That's amazing. On average, every star has a planet going around it. And about 1 in 20 of them, in turn, have Earth-sized planets going around them. So in other words, the basics of life, that is having a planet the size of the planet Earth and the right distance from the sun, may be much more plentiful than we originally thought. Now, one question I get in the emails is, well, we have all this data, all this fantastic amount of data. Can we now say definitively, one way or the other, the probability of life and intelligent life in the universe? And the answer to that, sadly, is no. Because on one hand, we're now flooded with data from thousands of planets orbiting other stars. About 20 of them, by the way, are very much like the Earth, except perhaps a little bit bigger than the planet Earth, and perhaps a little bit hotter than the planet Earth. But we see about 20 of them that are almost twins of the planet Earth. So on one hand, we have much more data points to work with. But on the other hand, the sad news is we now realize that life, that is the creation of DNA and eventually people, is extremely difficult. And we see more and more hurdles facing any planet out there that may one day harbor life. For example, look at our moon. Our moon is actually rather unusual because it's rather large, but it helps to stabilize the Earth. Without the moon, on a scale of a few million years, the Earth would tumble, making life impossible on the planet Earth. So our solar system needs a planet with a large moon, and not every planet has that. And then take a look at Jupiter. Computer programs show that if Jupiter did not exist, then Jupiter, the vacuum cleaner, would not have cleaned out the early solar system of the comets and asteroids and debris, and we would be constantly hit by gigantic meteors every few years, making life, once again, impossible on the planet Earth. So we're now beginning to realize with our computer models that it is rather difficult to get an Earth-like planet of the right size that has a stable environment for billions of years so that Jupiter cleaned out most of the debris of the early solar system. And not just 1, 2, or 3, but scores of different hurdles face us. For example, we now know that at one point the Earth was completely covered in ice. Snowball Earth, we call it, making life extremely difficult. So life was nearly extinguished at that point when the Earth was completely blanketed by ice. And we now know that intelligent life is much more difficult to get off the ground because many times in the past, humanity was almost wiped out. 70,000 years ago or so, there was a catastrophe which hit Homo sapiens, and only a handful of us, a few hundred, maybe 1,000, escaped that devastation. And then we, the survivors, the handful of Homo sapiens who survived that catastrophe, went on to repopulate the entire planet Earth. What was that event? We think it was, though we can't prove, the eruption of the Toba volcano in Indonesia. That volcano was sufficient to blanket Africa, to cause temperatures to plunge. Many animals went extinct, and we almost went extinct as well. Now, although it's very difficult to get intelligent life off the ground, there's some people who believe that, well, of course there are aliens in outer space, and they know that because they've been kidnapped. They've been abducted by the aliens. They know that, yes, indeed, there are aliens out there in outer space that have made contact with humans and have even kidnapped us. Well, I have a word of advice for those people that claim to have been abducted by flying saucer people. The next time you are in a flying saucer, for God's sake, steal something. I don't care what it is. An alien chip, an alien hammer, an alien paperclip, anything. Alien dandruff, alien DNA. I don't care what you can grab or steal. And remember, there's no law against stealing from an extraterrestrial. You're not going to go to jail for stealing a microchip from an extraterrestrial. However, you will have bragging rights. You will be able to end the debate once and for all. You know, without hard evidence, we're going to be debating flying saucers and UFOs thousands of years into the future. Are they nothing but a figment of our imagination, or are they real evidence of visitations? It's not something that is decidable with present-day technology. But you can end the debate right then and there if you steal something the next time you are kidnapped by a flying saucer. And then another question I get in my emails is, come on, give me a break. They say it's expensive. It's really expensive going into outer space. Why bother? Well, I had Carl Sagan on the airwaves on Exploration, and I asked him that very same question. Space is really, really expensive. So why bother to go? Well, it turns out that space is getting cheaper every year. For example, the Indian government sent a space probe all the way to Mars for $70 million. Now, Hollywood created a movie about going to Mars, The Martian, with Matt Damon. That movie cost $100 million. In other words, a Hollywood movie now about going to Mars costs more than actually going to Mars. That's how cheap space flight has become, so that even small nations with a fledgling space fleet can now send rockets into outer space to explore the universe. And Elon Musk wants to have reusable rockets. Just like the used car market revolutionized the car industry and car sales in America, changing American culture, in fact, with the car, it turns out that now used rockets are going to revolutionize the pricing of rockets to take us into outer space. It costs $10,000 to put a pound of anything into orbit around the Earth. $10,000 a pound. That's your weight in gold. Think of your body made out of solid gold. That's what it costs to put you in orbit around the Earth. However, Elon Musk wants to get it down to $1,000 a pound. So in other words, by a factor of 10, reducing the cost of space travel, literally opening up outer space to the average person. And in fact, Elon Musk of SpaceX has even bigger dreams. He eventually wants to put 1 million colonists on Mars. 1 million. He has big dreams. Now, we should point out, of course, that this has to be done in stages. In my new book, The Future of Humanity, which was a New York Times bestseller, I lay out the steps necessary to begin the long, arduous process of colonizing Mars. First is use lava tubes that already exist to create a Mars base. Second, mining operations. The first thing to mine is ice. Mars has plenty of ice. Ice can be melted to create drinking water. It can be chemically treated to give us hydrogen and oxygen for rocket fuel and for breathing. So mining ice to create the first mining operations on Mars. Then, more longer term, agriculture, creating genetically modified algae, genetically modified crops that would thrive in the carbon dioxide atmosphere of Mars, because, of course, plants love carbon dioxide. And the atmosphere of Mars is almost pure carbon dioxide. So create genetically modified plant organisms that can thrive in the cold atmosphere of Mars. And then long-term, satellites that can direct sunlight down to the polar ice caps. You know, Mars has plenty of water. It's frozen, but it's also frozen on the ice caps where it's concentrated, and you can melt it. By melting the ice, rivers will once again flow on Mars, which will create a greenhouse effect. The more water vapor you have, the more heat you get captured by the planet Mars. And you can even induce an artificial greenhouse effect if you want. The point is that if you can raise the temperature of Mars by 6 degrees, you can set off a runaway greenhouse effect and warm the entire planet, and one day terraform it so it becomes like the planet Earth.